Okay, so when you hear the name Franklin D. Roosevelt, what comes to mind? Probably the New Deal, right? Or leading America through World War II. But what if I told you he was also the president who signed the law that effectively kicked off America's war on cannabis? Well, that's what we're going to dig into today, this really surprising and mostly forgotten part of his legacy.
So you've got this one version of FDR that we all learn about in school, the guy who gave us Social Security, pulled the country through the Great Depression. But then there's this other history, the one where his administration lays the groundwork for federal cannabis prohibition. So how do you square that circle? How can both of these things be true for the same person?
Right. That's the big question here. How is that even possible? Was FDR secretly some kind of anti-cannabis crusader? Or was there something else entirely going on behind the scenes? That's exactly what we're going to unpack.
All right, let's start by just looking at how weird this is, how out of place this piece of his legacy feels. Yeah, I mean, father of weed prohibition, it just doesn't sound right, does it? It doesn't fit with the image of FDR we all have. It's a part of his story that's been almost totally brushed under the rug, but it's one that had absolutely massive consequences.
So to really get how this all went down, we have to rewind the clock back to the 1930s. The country was in a really specific, kind of volatile place. This slide really lays it out. You've got a perfect storm brewing. The Great Depression's in full swing, which is giving the federal government all sorts of new powers. Then, boom, 1933, alcohol prohibition gets repealed, and that creates a power vacuum. And just a few years later, in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act comes rushing in to fill it. And this is the key. The second alcohol was legal again, government agencies like the Federal Bureau of Narcotics were suddenly kind of pointless. They needed a new public enemy number one, a new moral panic to justify their jobs and their budgets. And they found one. Now, make no mistake, this wasn't some kind of popular uprising against cannabis. This was a very targeted crusade, led by a few very powerful people who had their own agendas. And here he is, the main architect of the whole thing, Harry Anslinger. As the head of the FBN, he just launched this relentless Take No Prisoners campaign against marijuana. And his main weapons? They weren't facts. They were fear, racially charged propaganda, and just a whole lot of misinformation to scare everyone into action. But Anslinger wasn't acting alone, not by a long shot. He had some incredibly powerful people in his corner. Guys like the industrialist Andrew Mellon and the media mogul William Randolph Hearst. Why? Well, their motivation was pretty simple. They wanted to get rid of hemp because it was a cheap, effective competitor to their own industries, like timber for paper and new synthetic fibers. So how did they pull it off? Not with a straightforward ban. Nope. They did something much, much cleverer. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And this is where it gets really sneaky. Instead of making cannabis illegal outright, which probably would have faced all sorts of legal challenges, they decided to just regulate it into oblivion. It was, for all intents and purposes, a backdoor prohibition. Okay, so check this out. Here's how it worked. First, they slapped a huge tax on cannabis. Then, they tangled it up in this crazy spiderweb of regulations and paperwork. This made it virtually impossible for anyone, doctors, farmers, whoever, to follow the law. And the result? If you had cannabis without jumping through all these impossible hoops, well, you were now a criminal. Which, of course, brings us right back to the man in the Oval Office. Why on earth would President Roosevelt sign a bill like this? Well, it all came down to a cold, hard political calculation. Look, there were probably three big reasons this got his signature. First, it was just politically pragmatic. FDR was desperate to get his New Deal programs passed, and he needed conservative support. Signing this was an easy bone to throw them. Second, it kept his powerful allies like Hearst happy. And finally, let's be honest, cannabis just wasn't high on his radar. He had a depression and a world war to worry about. And this quote really sums it all up, you know? For FDR, signing this thing was probably just a small political trade-off, a way to quiet some critics so he could focus on what he saw as the bigger picture. He almost certainly had no idea what the long-term blowback would be. But here's the thing about those small compromises. They often have enormous, generation-spanning consequences. August 2nd, 1937. With just one signature, a chain reaction was set in motion, a cycle of prohibition, arrests, and stigma that has deeply, profoundly shaped American society for almost a century. Ultimately, FDR's role in all of this is a textbook case of unintended consequences. He wasn't some evil mastermind trying to start a war on drugs. It's just a powerful reminder that even our greatest leaders can make big mistakes, and that political deals made for short-term gain can have devastating long-term costs.
And this number is just staggering. Over 80 years of federal prohibition. All of it tracing back to that one signature on one law that was pushed not for public health, but for a whole bunch of other reasons.
So what's the real takeaway here? The war on cannabis was never really about keeping people safe or healthy. It was born from a collision of politics, bureaucratic survival, corporate power, and personal influence, plain and simple.
This history forces us to ask a really tough question. If a seemingly small political compromise back then could spiral into something so massive, it makes you wonder, what compromises are being made today that future generations are going to have to untangle? It's definitely something to think about.